Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer was a notorious English serial killer who is believed to have murdered over 400 infants between 1869 and 1896. Dyer posed as a baby farmer, a person who was paid to care for unwanted infants, but instead she killed many of them and disposed of their bodies. Dyer's victims were typically illegitimate infants whose mothers were unable or unwilling to care for them. She would take in these infants and charge a fee for their care, but instead of caring for them, she would neglect or abuse them and eventually kill them by strangulation or other means. She then disposed of their bodies in various locations, including the River Thames. Dyer's crimes were eventually discovered in 1896, when the body of a baby was found floating in the river with a label from one of Dyer's advertisements. She was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder, and was hanged at Newgate Prison in 1896. Dyer's case drew attention to the issue of baby farming and led to the passage of legislation in the UK that required baby farmers to be registered and regulated. Her case remains a shocking and disturbing example of the dangers of unregulated childcare and the terrible consequences of neglect and abuse. Amelia Dyer life story. Amelia Dyer was born in 1837 in Bristol, England. She was the youngest of 5 children and her parents were well-respected shoemakers. However, her father died when she was young, and her mother suffered from mental health issues, which led to a difficult childhood for Amelia. At the age of 24, Amelia married George Thomas, a man who was much older than her and had a criminal record. The couple had one daughter together, but their marriage was not happy, and they eventually separated. Amelia later began working as a nurse, and it was during this time that she began to take in unwanted infants and charge a fee for their care. In the late 1800s, baby farming was a common practice in England, and it was largely unregulated. Many women, like Dyer, posed as baby farmers and took in infants from unmarried mothers who were unable or unwilling to care for them. However, instead of caring for the infants, many baby farmers neglected or abused them and even killed them. Dyer was known to have killed at least 400 infants, but the true number may have been much higher. She was eventually caught when the body of a baby was found floating in the Thames River with a label from one of Dyer's advertisements. When police searched Dyer's home, they found evidence of her crimes, including several dead infants. Dyer was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder. She was hanged at Newgate Prison in 1896. Her case drew attention to the issue of baby farming and led to the passage of legislation in the UK that required baby farmers to be registered and regulated. Today, Dyer's case remains a shocking and disturbing example of the dangers of unregulated childcare and the terrible consequences of neglect and abuse. How Amelia Dyer became a serial killer. There is no clear answer as to how Amelia Dyer became a serial killer. However, there are several factors that may have contributed to her actions. One possible factor is her difficult childhood. Dyer's father died when she was young, and her mother suffered from mental health issues. This may have left Dyer feeling neglected and emotionally unstable, which could have contributed to her later behavior. Another factor is the societal attitudes towards unmarried mothers and illegitimate children at the time. In the late 1800s, there was a stigma attached to being an unmarried mother, and many women were unable to care for their children because of social and economic pressures. Dyer took advantage of this by offering to care for the infants, but instead, she abused and killed them. It's also possible that Dyer had a mental illness that contributed to her behavior. Serial killers often have a history of mental health issues or other psychological problems, although this cannot be confirmed in Dyer's case as she was never formally diagnosed. Ultimately, the reasons behind Dyer's actions may never be fully understood. However, her case remains a shocking reminder of the terrible consequences of neglect and abuse, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable members of society. Amelia Dyer childhood? Amelia Dyer's childhood was marked by a number of difficulties and challenges. She was born on October 1837 in Bristol, England, and was the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Samuel Hobley, was a master shoemaker, but he died when Amelia was just a few months old. After her father's death, Amelia's mother, Sarah Hobley, struggled to provide for her family, and eventually remarried. However, Amelia did not get along with her stepfather, who was abusive towards her. Amelia was also said to have suffered from ill health as a child, which may have affected her development. She was described as being shy and withdrawn, and had few friends. She did, however, excel in needlework and was known for her skill in embroidery. Despite these challenges, Amelia was able to receive an education and went on to work as a nurse. It was during this time that she began taking in unwanted infants and charging a fee for their care, a practice that eventually led to her becoming a notorious serial killer. While there is no clear link between Amelia's childhood experiences and her later actions, it is possible that the trauma and abuse she suffered may have contributed to her psychological state and played a role in her becoming a serial killer. Amelia Dyer modus operandi? Amelia Dyer's modus operandi, or method of operation, was to take in unwanted infants and young children from unmarried mothers and adoptive parents who could not afford to care for them. She would then neglect and abuse the children, often starving them or administering poison, until they died. Dyer's victims were typically under the age of 1, and many were in poor health or had disabilities. She would often advertise her services in newspapers under the guise of a respectable nurse or baby farmer, offering to take in children for a fee. Once she had the children in her care, she would often move them from place to place to avoid suspicion. She would also change her name frequently to avoid detection by the authorities. Dyer's crimes went unnoticed for years, as the high mortality rate among infants and young children was not uncommon in the late 1800s. However, her crimes eventually came to light when a baby's body was found in the Thames River with a label from one of Dyer's advertisements. After her arrest, Dyer admitted to killing at least 400 infants, although the true number of her victims may have been much higher. She was convicted of murder and hanged at Newgate Prison in 1896. Amelia Dyer crimes? Amelia Dyer was a notorious serial killer who is believed to have murdered dozens, if not hundreds, of infants and young children in England in the late 1800s. Her crimes involved taking in unwanted infants and young children from unmarried mothers and adoptive parents who could not afford to care for them. She would then neglect and abuse the children, often starving them or administering poison, until they died. Dyer's crimes were particularly heinous because they targeted the most vulnerable members of society, innocent infants and young children who were unable to defend themselves. How Amelia Dyer got caught? Amelia Dyer was eventually caught after a baby's body was found floating in the Thames River in 1896. The body was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and a label was attached to it with the address of a woman named Mrs. Thomas, one of Dyer's aliases. Police were able to track down the woman and found that she had recently moved from a house in Reading, where they discovered the bodies of several more infants. Dyer was arrested and charged with murder. Dyer's crimes had gone unnoticed for years, in part because the high mortality rate among infants and young children at the time meant that many deaths were not investigated. However, her actions eventually caught the attention of the authorities, and her arrest and conviction helped to raise awareness of the dangers posed by unlicensed baby farmers and the need for better regulation of infant care. How Amelia Dyer case ended. The case of Amelia Dyer ended with her conviction and execution for murder in 1896. During her trial, Dyer confessed to killing at least 400 infants, although the true number of her victims is not known. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Today, Amelia Dyer is remembered as one of the most notorious serial killers in British history, and her crimes continue to shock and horrify people more than a century after her death. How Amelia Dyer died. Amelia Dyer was executed by hanging on June 10, 1896, at Newgate Prison in London, England. Dyer's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds, as was customary for executed criminals at the time. Today, the case of Amelia Dyer continues to fascinate and horrify people, and her crimes serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of greed and exploitation, as well as the need to protect the most vulnerable members of society.